delighted to introduce our next session, Sri Aurobindo, Pariksith Singh in conversation with Malashri Lal. Pariksith Singh, alongside being a medical doctor, is also a poet and philosopher. In his book, our discussion today, Sri Aurobindo and the Literary Renaissance of India, he has compared Sri Aurobindo with 15 titans of philosophy, starting from the likes of Nietzsche and Derrida and to many others. He calls Sri Aurobindo the father of Akhanda Bharat, or Undivided India. In conversation with writer and academic Malashri Lal, Singh explores their perspective of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy and his inner quest as articulated in his writings and life. Pariksith Singh, our author today, MD, is the CEO of Access Healthcare, one of the largest group practices in Florida, and he's an essayist, poet, story writer, translator, and medical educator who has published 7 anthologies of poetry in both Hindi and English. He also published the Healthcare Primer 2018, Healthcare Compliance and Medicare Risk Adjustment. Malashri Lal is an academic, editor, and writer with 16 books to her credit. She retired as a professor from the English department of the University of Delhi with a specialization in literature and gender studies. Lal was senior consultant to the Ministry of Culture and is an active member of International Book Award juries, alongside being on the English Advisory Board of the Sahitya Academy. May I also now invite on stage Mr. Sanjoy Roy to help us release a book, and he's going to be telling more about it in just a second.
Thanks. Thank you, Mridul. Before we release the book, I just wanted to say a few words. We met with Pariksith Singh accidentally. He came to the Jaipur Literature Festival in some capacity to broker peace with a festival that he was supporting, which was the other festival. And I remember in my first conversation, he said, why can we advertise I'd said, why don't we advertise the other festival here? And he said, I think they don't like you guys. I said, but listen, if we all work together, we can grow, the pie rather than trying to slice the pie up. But since then, Pariksith has been a great supporter of the Jaipur Literature Festival and JLF in the United States as well. He was our sponsor in Boulder and Toronto. And hopefully this November, we will be opening a new program in Florida. By the way, in Florida, there's a place called Spring Hill, which is actually known as Singh Hill because it's mostly his, it's known after him. But we were looking at this wonderful center that he and Dr. Maria, his partner and wife, has opened up in this place, which looks at meditation, food, therapies, everything that is contrary to what he practices, which is medicine as we know. She is the counter point to that, and she practices everything within the natural remedies, etc. So together we're launching the Mind, Body, Soul festival in November of 2nd to the 4th of November 2022. And here, of course, he's in his capacity both as publisher. They have set up a new imprint, which they set up in India, and we're absolutely delighted to have his support. And again, thank you so much, Maladi, for being here. And I'm absolutely delighted in releasing a book, which in some way is also related to my, just for the record, I'm 32, but I was in university with Partho, who is slightly older now, and is your editor of this whole series. So absolutely delighted to be here, and thank you both.
Watch your step. Be careful. We can open it.
It's indeed a great joy to be in this session with Dr. Pariksith Singh. And the book that we are discussing is on Sri Aurobindo. It comes to me as an unexpected and an unusual book. Unexpected because Dr. Pariksith Singh is a medical doctor, and we don't always associate a great deal of meditation, deep research, into literature, a sense of the supernatural, the mystic dimensions of life from a practicing physician who's very, very busy indeed. On the other hand, it's also an unusual book because it is about Sri Aurobindo's literature more than about the depths of his philosophy. It's also written in a rather different way from the books that one usually encounters because each chapter is a burst of energy. They're short chapters, a large number of them, absolutely fascinating. And Parikshit has referred to comparisons with Western philosophy and Western writers much more than we usually get when people are talking about Sri Aurobindo. So my request to Parikshit to begin this conversation would be to tell us about the inception and the motivation that took you to create this book.
Thank you, Maladi, for having me here, and I appreciate you all. This book is really a labor of love. I've been reading Sri Aurobindo for the last 30 years. I learned a lot from him about literature, poetry, art, and of course about, last 2 years we've been through the pandemic. Being a physician, we went through quite a terrible time with our patients. And then in October of 2020, I myself got COVID, and things were pretty bad for 5 weeks. And at that time, it kind of came as a burst of inspiration and kind of almost a way for me to get into a different mode, and it became a kind of a healing experience because I was able to write things that were important when you were really sick. And at that time, there weren't really many treatments for COVID. There was no vaccine. It looked pretty bad. Coming out of that, I think your perspective changes about life, and then you really look back at what have I really done that's important. So I think when this book came, I think it's one of the things that one wanted to do for the longest time, and I'm glad it came out within a short period of 2 months. Of course, the preparation was many years.
It's a very moving and a personal story that brought you to actually write a book that you must have been thinking about for a very long time. And you've known and devoted yourself to Sri Aurobindo studies for many years. Well, something good also happens when one goes through a difficult situation.
Yes.
One of the points that you make in the book is that Sri Aurobindo has not received the kind of recognition as a literary writer,
yes,
as he well deserved. And you're entirely right in saying so, Parikshit, because Savitri is a poem that we've all heard about, but I'm not sure how many people have read all of it. And yet it has the unique distinction of being one of the longest epics in the English language that has
yes.
been written out of India. And it's a deeply philosophical theme, although it depends on a mythological core. There's a great deal of the contemporary that was to Aurobindo.
Yes.
And I like reading that poem very much. And I think it has a lot of relevance to readers today.
Yes.
So what would you like to say about the literary qualities of Savitri and how one can attract more readership to this marvelous poem?
Savitri is a difficult poem. It's not difficult, say, like The Wasteland or the Four Quartets from T.S. Eliot was. It is not difficult like Wallace Stevens was. Savitri seems very simple on the surface, but the experimentation in Savitri is with the sound. And what he tried to bring was the vibratory experience that you get from the Sanskrit recitations of the mantras. He tried to bring that mantric sound, and he was a big believer that poetry can reach its fullest possibility only when we fulfill all the criteria, not just meaning, which is where modern poetry is focused, or imagery, but also sound. And to fully exploit all the possibilities of sound, the resonances, the harmonies. He attempted something new, and he also attempted classical. He wrote classical Greek and Latin meters. He transplanted them into English, and some of those experiments are absolutely beautiful. Of course, by the time he had passed on, we had reached a post-Eliotian phase in India, Indian English literature, and there was almost a kind of distancing of the poets after him, since someone like Nissim Ezekiel and Parthasarthi and Mehrotra, they all moved away from him. But if you look back at him, he would be to a classic like Milton. Milton with his experimentations, with his Latinization of English language, even some inversions of the sentence. But Milton gave us the first real epic in English language. And, you know, people have come and gone, smaller poets have come and gone. Milton lives on as a classic case, perhaps after Shakespeare, the greatest poet in the English language. And Sri Aurobindo gave us a break from Milton. The problem, the challenge with Milton is so powerful a poet that after him, the blank verse suffered. Blank verse, anyone writing in blank verse had to distance himself or herself from Milton, which was a huge challenge because Milton is oppressive, is so powerful. And that's what Eliot called the Miltonic wall. And very few poets could break through that. Sri Aurobindo finally breaks through that by bringing in the sounds of Sanskrit and giving us a new kind of blank verse. That is something that people have not realized. In an epic of 24,000 lives, there will be patches where the lines may be less powerful than its strongest passages. But if we look at the strongest passages in the experiment that he did, we will realize what a powerful change he brought into the English language, which is something that has not been appreciated yet, but I believe he is a poet of the future. And as we read him, as we understand him, we will realize what all he has done to the English language.
It would be lovely if you could select a passage to read from Savitri. And while you do that, I want to take up and develop the point that you made about the innovations that many writers such as Sri Aurobindo made to the genre of English poetry. Because like Sri Aurobindo, there was, of course, Tagore, Sarojini Naidu, Michael Madhusudan Dutt. Many of these great writers were schooled in a certain kind of formal English literature. And therefore, there was the impact of Milton and Shakespeare and other greats. But each one of them wrote in English, modified it, experimented with other languages, and came out absolutely at the highest level of excellence when it came to innovation and developing new poetic constructs, which worked equally well in English and which took on the rhythm of local Indian regional languages and poetic genres. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. So it's really with Sarojini Naidu that we started, and Michael Madhusudan Dutt, that we came back to our own themes, our own myths, and they transformed our literature. We were no longer looking to the white sahibs to approve us. We would write our own literature. And then Sri Aurobindo, when he brought the Indian themes, Indian philosophy, Indian darshana to our literature, he opened the path for others, the poets after him, to follow. And today, if Nissim Ezekiel and A.K. Mehrotra and Parthasarthi and all these criticize him, they don't realize that they are his children. Because of him, they are able to today write freely about Indianness, about our themes, our life, our difficulties, and not try to ape the Western world, and not write about the British autumn and the swallows in their gardens there. They can write about our animals and our birds and our living experience. I totally agree.
So true. So a few lines from Savitri, if you'd read that for us, please.
Yeah, I'll. So if I may, I will first read Milton, so you get a sense of the rhythm, what Milton did, and then see if you can catch the note, the different note of blank verse that came with Sri Aurobindo. So I'll read first few lines of Milton from Paradise Lost, his masterpiece. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain that blissful seat. See the rhythm? Hear the rhythm? Now listen to this rhythm, which is much different. Now I'll let you listen to it without describing it. It was the hour before the gods awake. Across the path of the divine event, the huge foreboding mind of night, alone in her unlit temple of eternity, lay stretched immobile upon silence marge. Almost one felt opaque, impenetrable, in the somber symbol of her eyeless muse, the abysm of the unbodied infinite. A fathomless zero occupied the world. Now, if you can catch the note, he has opened it up, and there's a new vibration to the language. And that's something that, if you have a nuanced sense of the language, you can pick it up.
Beautiful lines indeed. And I think people will go back to Savitri if we talk enough about the poem and hear somebody like you reading it to us, where you can catch the cadence of the language indeed. Right. So even where Sri Aurobindo's literature is not that extensively read and discussed, certainly his spiritualism is.
Yes.
So may I take this conversation to the subject of the supramental manifestation, about which Sri Aurobindo has written so much and that he believed in. The idea being that every human consciousness is capable of a progressive evolution to higher and higher refinement.
Yes.
Of course, he put it in different words and much more beautifully than any of us can express it. But the philosophy itself seems a little difficult to grasp, to understand, to imbibe. So I would like to hear from you how that wonderful philosophy of the supramental can actually be simplified, maybe, so that it becomes more commonly understood, practiced. We don't all have to succeed in it, but at least let's try. But that attraction happens when the language in which the philosophy comes is accessible. So do you think Aurobindo is accessible at that level, or is it for the intellectual elite and the already people who are on the spiritual path?
No, Sri Aurobindo is very simple, elegant, beautiful. The challenge is, of course, he is so vast that he has absorbed everything in his vision, so it becomes challenging to be able to put all that together. But if we simplify, let's simplify it. What does that supramental consciousness mean? And so let's start with ourselves, where we are, without putting out any abstractions. So we are mental beings, right? We think, we have abstractions in our mind, words come to our mind, and that's who we are. We have impressions, all our sensuous impressions, our emotions, they get expressed through our mind. But if we would pay attention, a little bit attention to ourselves, we are not just mental beings. We are not just a mental consciousness. We are also, if I may start from the beginning, we also have a physical awareness. Most of the time it's buried because we live in the mind. But if we would, what happens when we are asleep? What keeps us going? What continues breathing? Why do our lungs keep moving? Why is our heart beating? There is an intelligence, there is something that is holding it together. That physical awareness, if we just become a little quiet, we will realize that the body has its own awareness. So we are not just mental beings, we are also physical beings. And if we become sensitive, and this is a very common experience. What happens if you get angry? You will feel something right here, right? Or you're in pain, someone has hurt you, or you're very ambitious. It comes from the gut. That is what is called the pranic center, the vital center. That is the center of life. And that is a different awareness. That is the awareness that gives us life, what you would see in a plant. The plant has its own awareness and its own intelligence. What is giving the plant the ability to move towards the sun, what is allowing the plant to draw the water from the root. Something is alive there, something is moving. That is the material intelligence moving to a vital intelligence. If we look at the world around us, everything, this matter, this looks dead, right? This is dead, this is not moving, this is static. But think about it. If we go to quantum physics, and if we look at the old model of atoms and electrons and the neutrons and the positrons, everything in electrons are moving. And if we go even further to the subatomic levels, we will find that everything is so beautifully and perfectly integrated and synchronized. What is that intelligence? Where is that intelligence coming from that can handle the most microscopic areas, most microscopic levels to the greatest galaxies? There is evidently an intelligence in the material world that is expressing itself. That matter comes out in plants. That matter turns into animals which are alive. That's the vital awareness. And that comes into us, who are mental beings. So these are different layers of awareness. C.V. Raman did an experiment with plants, and he showed that plants have awareness. They have their likes, they have their dislikes. If you hurt them, they will move away from it. How does the plant know this? So there is an awareness. We think the plant is not alive because we are mental. Plant has a different awareness. So in ancient India, and even now, if someone meditates or does a simplest bit of yoga, you will realize that there are other levels of awareness. Moment of deep love, what happens? Your own awareness disappears. You're into a different phase where the other becomes important. Our own self-centeredness changes into consideration and embrace of the other. That is a different awareness. That is a wider awareness, an awareness of everyone. It is a cosmic awareness where the feeling comes from here, and there is empathy, there is compassion, there is love. We are all capable of it. We have it. We're just not aware of it. Similarly, there are levels of awareness which we describe in yoga as centers above our head. These are the supramental states of awareness. And anyone who has experienced, say, moments of intense emotion, anger, pain, will realize that sometimes there'll be a complete detachment from the mental activities, and one almost feels like there is someone else watching. That's another level of awareness. So these different levels of awareness, people who research this find them, and Sri Aurobindo described each of them in detail. These are the overmental awareness, intuitive awareness, illuminated awareness, and finally the supramental awareness. See, normally when we are thinking, when we want to do something, we think and then we do. There's a gap between our thought and the doing. The higher we reach, there is not a gap between the thought and the action, the will and the force. And then we realize that consciousness is its own force. If you can hold your awareness, if you can be quiet, your consciousness can be directed. We feel that consciousness is passive. Consciousness is very alive, very active. So a higher level of consciousness that is more effective, that is more dynamic, that can change things directly, that would be a hint towards the supramental awareness. Now, if we can reach that, if we can live that, if we feel the love for each other, if we have empathy, just at the beginning, we begin transforming the world.
Very well put and beautifully explained. Thank you, Pariksith. So indeed, we have different levels of awareness, and we can rise to greater and greater understanding and self-awareness through certain ways of looking around the world and being sensitive to our experiences. I completely agree. But I want to turn to the earlier part of Sri Aurobindo's life. Was it a linear journey, I wonder? A young man into politics, radical thinker, a person who believed in a certain kind of violent action for which he also got into trouble. Sister Nivedita warned him that he may get arrested, so then he goes away to Chandanagar. From there, he then decides suddenly his life takes a different turn because he decides to set up an ashram in Pondicherry. Now, this journey from being an angry young man to being a quiescent spiritual leader, was it a linear journey? Was it something that happened because of circumstances? One just wonders at the two Aurobindos, or maybe three. One, the Aurobindo of youthful radical politics. Second, the Aurobindo of literary writing. And third, Aurobindo of the spiritual leadership.
Yeah, it's my understanding is there are themes running through it, through his whole life. There are certain consistent themes. Even when he was in England, he studied in England. He was sent by his parents, his father, to England because his father believed in the Western culture. He did not think Indian culture was any good. He wanted his children to be all Westernized. So he grew up to be a Western child of Western education. He was brilliant, a great scholar in Latin, in Greek. He knew 6 languages. He was a polyglot. He passed through the exams, took the ICS exam. He would have become an IAS officer or ICS officer in those days. Very powerful, a very high level of success. And he refused that. He wanted his country to be independent. That was his passion. He started certain societies in England. I think it was called Lotus and Dagger Society. And then when he came, he started absorbing what India was. He started learning what India was. And almost 10 years he spends understanding, because he had no idea about India. And he absorbs it. And then at the beginning of the 19th century, he starts coming out. And then the great partition of Bengal happens, and Sri Aurobindo is there. He leaves his job in Baroda. It was a nice, comfortable job, and he jumps into India's independence, struggle for independence. He is the one who convinced his colleagues, the other leaders around him, that India should be, must be, and will be independent. Swaraj was something that he drilled into our national consciousness. Before him, there were great writers and leaders who thought of it. Anand Mat was written by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. We had an aspiration for Swarajya by Tilak, who said Swarajya is my birthright. But these were thought to be dreams. It was deluded to think that you could be free from England. England was the most powerful force in the world. 50% of the earth was ruled by England. It was a Pax Britannica. It was foolish to think that you could be free of England. And yet, from 1905 to 1947, 42 years, India became free. He drilled it into us that this is who we are, and not just a violent approach. It was based on a deep understanding that we have our own genius, that we have our own swadharma, and we need to follow it. If we lose it, we are going to be slaves forever. If we find it, then we can find our true independence. So his research had already brought it out. So that spiritual thread was already there. But of course, it flowered when he moved to Pondicherry. He loved India. That was probably his biggest attachment, if there was any. And he loved India to the end. To his last days, he was focused on what would happen to an independent India. So the revolutionary, yes, became a gentle, great, wise being, but still focused on India. Not in a parochial sense, not in a narrow sense, but because India would do good to humanity, not only good to itself, but in a very vast, universal way. And so the writing was his program to bring out who we are. He researched the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Gita, and brilliant essays to let us realize who we are. Because until we realize who we are, our own swadharma, whatever it is, we cannot be really free. So because this was brought out, because we began to understand what the Vedas meant. Before that, the Western translators of the Vedas said, oh, this is just naturalism written by very primitive people, by barbarians. And when he read it, he said, no, this is very refined, elegant poetry. And he went to the Sanskrit roots and the symbology and showed us how deep the Vedas were. and how Vedanta was a very advanced form of philosophy and darshana, and how he translated the Gita and brought the dynamic action of Gita back to the forefront, rather than being from Mayavad, the illusionism that we had fallen prey to. So these threads you will see through his life. Peter Hees has written a book, The Many Lives of Sri Aurobindo. But even there, you see common threads running through his whole life.
Well, one of the interesting features of your book, Parikshit, is that you have chapters which compare Sri Aurobindo with thinkers, philosophers, poets, writers. I was fascinated by the many of those chapters, but may I bring up the one on Rabindranath Tagore? Because both of them have certain similarities. I mean, they were both visionaries, thinkers, loved India to be free, worked in that direction. In their own ways, they set up ashrams, if one may say so. Education, spiritual thinking, those are all tools towards self-development and understanding of what it means to be Indian. And they had very broad vision, Tagore of his universal humanism. We were just talking about Aurobindo and his idea of the supramental consciousness. So in your view, what is the crux of the comparison between Tagore and Sri Aurobindo as leaders, as thinkers, as people who had the vision of a free India?
There are great parallels between these two geniuses, and I feel they are the two Renaissance men that India was blessed with at a very crucial state of its development and of its attempt to free itself. Tagore was probably the artist par excellence, a great lyricist, a playwright, a novelist, someone who wrote essays, stories. He transformed Bengali literature into something way beyond any other language, Indian language had accomplished at that time. In fact, he was kind of the final, one of the products of Bengal Renaissance. But all his poetry is very deeply spiritual. He was influenced by the Bauls, by the Sufis in Bengal, and his vision of Vaishnava Bhakti is yet a vast humanitarian vision. He includes his vastness in his elaborate approach. He wants the future humanity to absorb the best of the Indian traditions and the Western traditions. He wanted to transform education, bring art into the education. He did not appreciate the Western Macaulite version of education. And that's why he wanted to create his own university, and he did. Shantiniketan was a great experiment. Unfortunately, after Tagore left, it seems to have fallen into disrepair. Sri Aurobindo had a different vision, but they had a deep admiration for each other. Both Sri Aurobindo was not so much a lyricist, but a great artist himself. His essays, his translations, his philosophy, his attempts at epic poetry in English are amazing. Even his aphorisms, even his short story, which only he left us one, his speeches are powerful literature, but of a different sort. Sri Aurobindo may be considered to be a more cerebral or supra-cerebral writer than Tagore, who was more a singer, a man of the heart. But again, Sri Aurobindo was also a futurist, and he wanted to create an education system that brings out the deepest values of Indian darshana, of Indian culture. Sri Aurobindo was deeply concerned about what is our future going to be. Is it going to be, as he said, Bolshevism? Is it going to be Gunda Raj? Or are we going to truly find what our aptitude is, or what is called Swabhava? And they admired each other deeply. It is beautiful that after Sri Aurobindo came out of Alipur jail, Tagore went to meet him and penned a poem in his honor. And then when Sri Aurobindo moved to Pondicherry, Tagore went to see him on one of his world journeys. And again, he penned, and he called him a great rishi who needs to speak to us his word. Please give us your word. And Sri Aurobindo admired Tagore deeply and said he is on the same path as ours. So they had a deep spiritual connection. They had a deep respect for each other. They kind of took paths that are slightly different, but a lot of parallels, which are beautiful. And we can learn so much from them, how they held each other in highest regard.
That's a very interesting way, the way you put the parallel parts and also the differences. We can hardly talk about Sri Aurobindo without wanting to reflect on the mother.
Yes.
And yet, Parikshit, I found in your book, there was not much about the mother. So I'd like you to come into this discussion because the mother seems to have been the person who implemented the vision and the philosophy of Sri Aurobindo. The management of the ashram was very much with her. She was a great leader, great achiever. And those last 12 years of Sri Aurobindo's life, when he virtually withdrew from everything and everybody, and yet the ashram grew, flourished, was most efficiently conducted by the mother. On a personal note, my husband and I were in Pondicherry and we met Nirod Baron, who was, like you, a medical doctor and the closest disciple of Sri Aurobindo for his literary works. He was the scribe for Savitri. And Dr. Nirod Baron also wrote poems. And he was one of the very few people who had access to Sri Aurobindo in those last few years because he was also a doctor. So what has been the role of the mother in being able to further the vision of Sri Aurobindo in his own life so that he could withdraw in many ways from the nitty-gritty, the materiality of the everyday existence and the management of the ashram?
The reason I didn't write about the mother is simple. I would have had to write another book to describe what she did, or perhaps several books. Sri Aurobindo himself said, all that I had in realization was held within. She's the one who gave it a body. She brought it and executed his vision, his realizations. And another amazing, beautiful human being who completely surrendered herself to the Indian culture and the Indian ethos and how we see the world, absorbed it completely, totally Western. Another individual who was brought up in the Western system, absorbed India and brought something beautiful, a great synergy. If you go to Pondicherry, you will see an elaborate ecosystem that she created. She had publishing houses, she had a bakery, she had a farmhouse, organic farming, she had products for export. She was probably handling an ashram of 1,000 people, taking care of them, a school, a university. I mean, almost, and then the greatest, Auroville, the future university, the future city, the city without borders, where you do not have a tag to you, where you go, you're a human being. You're not Indian or Japanese or British or Ukrainian. You are color blind. You don't look at the color. You don't look at the race. You don't look at the caste. It is a city that is aspiring to create something beautiful for humanity's future. And that was an amazing contribution, a work that I believe will have great significance in the years to come, almost creating a parallel system from the system that she had already created. And that is the genius. I mean, I run a company of 200 physicians, almost 1,200 people. And I can tell you, managing so many people, so many humans, talk about supramental, so many mental beings is almost an impossible task. So I truly admire what she did. And without her, his work would not have been executed. His books would not have been published.
I want to conclude this conversation between us and then open it up to the floor. Do you then believe that the medical sciences and the spiritual sciences have to join together if we are to move towards a holistic understanding of the human body individually and as a social body and a community of harmony?
Absolutely. We have to be willing to step outside our box in healthcare and allopathic medicine, which is great for acute care. If you have trauma, it's great, but for chronic conditions, for prevention, you need something else. And to realize that we are not just physical beings, coming back to our previous discussion, we are also mental beings, we are emotional beings, we are vital beings, and we are also spiritual beings. And until we understand a fullness, a wholeness to our development and our activities in life, and our appreciation of each other, our healthcare will not be complete. And that these two have to come together, these two have to kind of meld together to give us a futuristic way of healing. I'm not calling it healthcare, would call it healing, which each of us could do with.
Thank you. So Dr. Pariksith Singh would be happy to take any questions that are brief from members of the audience. Can we get a mic to the persons there? Oh, that's Reba, please.
I enjoyed listening to both of you. I just had an observation, and I wonder whether you'd agree, which is that there was such a harmony of thought between Mother and Sri Aurobindo. And I was wondering whether it was because both of them were westernized in their initial phases of their life. And then they were together on a journey to discover India. I think Aurobindo studied in London. He was totally westernized. And so was Mira's background, Mira Richards. So they both started off understanding a lot of values, and then they both come into another phase of discovering India. Because there is a total harmony in their thought, which is not always the case from different cultures.
Yes.
I just wondered whether you could comment.
That's a beautiful insight. I see they started from scratch. They were brought up in another system. They came up with a great openness. They came up with a desire to learn, and with a lot of, what, if I may say, humility. They wanted to learn what India offers. And both of them experimented. They were not afraid of experimentation. They were not afraid to question. They did not accept blindly all that Indian culture is or all that Indian darshana is. There were things they did not accept, including things like our ways of dividing each other, our bad habits. They rejected that. But they were open, they were humble, they absorbed the best of both civilizations, or the, shall I say, both two different ways of looking at the world, the Western and the Eastern. And because I think there was a great openness, there was a tremendous respect for each other. And in a way, these were iconoclasts. When people, traditionalists would go to their ashram, they would run away, because you would have women, girls would be there, girls wearing shorts. What kind of an ashram was that? Traditional ashram, no women were allowed, I'm sorry, but women were not allowed. Why? Because you are not fit for a spiritual life. Most ashrams did not allow women. She said, no, we're going to have women. We're going to have girls. We're going to have them, girls with the boys, studying together, playing together, sports a part of your spiritual education. Such a vast way of seeing the world. And that kind of, that eclecticism, that Catholicism, that openness, I think that allowed them, that gave them a lot of respect for each other. And it's beautiful how they regarded each other. It's one of the great stories of synergy between two human beings.
Indeed true. Can we get a mic across there, please?
Thank you so much. You were talking about plant having awareness, and which is beyond our understanding. I wanted to ask on the concept of veganism, where people are saying that plants don't have feelings, animals do, so we will make our entire food in plant-based. How, I mean, now that you're talking about plant awareness, how could I connect that to it?
Yeah, a beautiful question. So let's first, as scientists, if we appreciate that there is an awareness inherent through the universe. Now, it's not mental awareness. There is some force that is connecting the universe, right? Matter, then you come to a plant, vegetable level, and then animals. And that's why animals are at a higher level of awareness, higher level of organized awareness. There is a beginning of individuation is happening. A dog will start individualizing, personalizing. If you live with a dog, you will see that. Plants are not individualized. Yes, they too suffer. That suffering is not of that conscious level. So obviously we have to live. And if you go back to our Indian tradition, when we even pick a flower or a fruit from a plant, inwardly we honor that plant. Japanese system, when they cut a fish, they apologize to the fish, realizing that the fish has awareness. So we have what are the ascetics who go around? They are masters of the plant. They know the plant so well. They can tell you this fruit is ripe. The plant is telling you this fruit is ripe. Don't eat this fruit. This will make you sick. They can connect with it. Plants don't have the ego like we do. They are happy to give. If you sit next to a tree, you will find beautiful vibrations in the tree. So they are very giving. We just have to have the respect for that. Now, when I say they're giving, they're not mentally giving. It is the nature of the plant. So yes, there is consciousness in the vegetable world. It is not if you are respectful of this and you're aware of it, then you have a more conscious life, and even the vegetable world, you're going to treat it with great respect. I hope that answered the question.
We have time for just one question, please, and keep it brief. Yes, please.
Thank you, sir. Hello, sir. Sir, I've tried many times to read and understand Aurobindo, but I couldn't ever. So would you suggest where should I start from? And maybe I thought I was not developed. Okay, sir.
You can start
but
with
still,
this.
I would like you to explain it a little bit. How can I understand him? I have many books, but I could never understand him.
I'm going to go with Mala Didi. Read The Mother. So much simpler, direct, and that's the difference between a great man and a great woman. Woman tells you direct, do this, do this, do this. And as Margaret Thatcher said, if you want something discussed, you tell a man. If you want something done, you tell the woman, it will be done.
Well,
and I say this with utmost respect for Sri Aurobindo. Of course, without his realization, it's the Shiva consciousness. The Shiva consciousness envisions. They have the vision. The woman, the Shakti consciousness, executes, make it happen. That is our traditional system. Start with the mother. And my goal is to simplify Sri Aurobindo. Even Vedanta, we don't understand. To simplify that and make it easy for everyone to understand. Hopefully, if I can do that, it will be worth this life.
I would certainly suggest that you read Dr. Pariksith Singh's book on Sri Aurobindo. And like many other people, I had similar questions too, that how do I get to understand the intricacy, the subtlety of Sri Aurobindo's thoughts, and the very vast range of his output. And then I found many of those answers in Parikshit's book. And yes, the writings by the mother, they're available in very brief, little handy chapbook sizes, subject-wise. So anybody wants a primer to understanding Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, that's a great way to start. But I want to congratulate you, Dr. Pariksith Singh, on a beautiful book, deeply researched and yet rendered in a way that it places Sri Aurobindo in a global context, both historical and global. Your chapters on philosophy look at Wittgenstein and many other major European philosophers and what the interlink is with Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. You've looked at him as a literature, and I discovered for the first time that Sri Aurobindo had written short stories, or at least tried to write them. He completed only one, but he left drafts of many others. I didn't know that he had written aphorisms, short pithy sayings when he was a young person. And then, of course, the deep philosophy of the supramental consciousness that has all of us engaged in understanding the relatedness of everything within creation. So thank you very much for the wonderful book and thoughtful conversation. My thanks to this great audience for its very participative engagement with this session.
Thank you.
In case you missed it at the beginning, there's also a book launch, Somewhere Among the Stars, which is written by a dear friend of Sir and the festival. We also urge you to check out copies of both the books outside. We thank Pariksith Singh and Malashri Lal for that deeply enlightening discussion. And we thank Dainik Bhaskar for their support. A huge round of applause for our panel today. And we hope to see you in future sessions. Thank you.